And so I'll throw a dart at the map and start with a 2003 Vanity Fair story by the journalist Vicky Ward. Miss Ward was one of the few people who was on to Jeffrey Epstein very early, long before his first conviction back in the mid-2000s. Back in the early 2000s, Epstein was still getting press like this in New York Magazine, quote, "Jeffrey Epstein, international money man of mystery. He comes with cash to burn, a fleet of airplanes, and a keen eye for the ladies, to say nothing of a relentless brain that challenges Nobel Prize-winning scientists across the country, and for financial markets around the world. Ever since the Post's Page 6 ran an item about President Clinton's late September visit to Africa with Kevin Spacey and Chris Tucker on Epstein's customized Boeing 727, the question of the day has been, who in the world is Jeffrey Epstein? End quote. Once again, unsurprisingly, American journalism does not miss an opportunity to beclown itself and to vomit all over the legacy of the real reporters who occasionally used to take up the profession. Reporters like Vicky Ward, for example. She was writing for Vanity Fair in the early 2000s when she got an early lead on what the talented Mr. Epstein was up to behind the scenes. This is from the New York Times after Epstein was arrested more recently in 2019. Quote, "Days after Jeffrey E. Epstein was arrested and charged with sex trafficking by federal prosecutors, the fallout spilled into the media world, with a former Vanity Fair journalist saying that she had been prepared to report on accusations of sexual misconduct against the financier years ago, but that the magazine had declined to print them. The journalist, Vicky Ward, leveled her accusation against the magazine's former editor, Graydon Carter, in several forums, including on her own Twitter account, Slate's What Next podcast, and BuzzFeed's AM to DM talk show. As part of her reporting for an article published in Vanity Fair's March 2003 issue, Miss Ward said, she had collected on-the-record accusations against Mr. Epstein from 3 women, 2 of whom said they were victims of sexual assault. Those accusations did not make it into the published version, end quote. And so you think, well, look, a magazine's got to be careful, right? Vanity Fair's a big publication. They've reported on controversial stories in the past. And they got the experience to know where they stand. So maybe the stories didn't get through the magazine's tight vetting process. Maybe legal wouldn't let it through. Well, no. In fact, according to Miss Ward, the story had already been through legal review and was approved with the accusations included. But then, just before the article went to print...
All right, in recent months, the press has been digging into news about the late Jeffrey Epstein, his powerful friends, and the allegations that he sexually exploited dozens of underage girls. For years, the media had paid only intermittent attention to the Epstein story until an investigative series last year in the Miami Herald. NPR media correspondent David Folkenflick's story might help explain why. It includes an early morning visit, a bullet, and a dead cat.
One morning some years ago, Vanity Fair's editor-in-chief, Graydon Carter, arrived at the magazine's offices in Midtown Manhattan. A man was standing still, by himself, in the magazine's reception area behind locked glass doors. It was Epstein. John Connolly was a Vanity Fair contributing editor who reported on crime and scandal.
Jeffrey had somehow gotten into the Vanity Fair's office before Graydon one day, and he was torturing Graydon.
Connolly says Epstein repeatedly beseeched and berated Carter, then and in subsequent calls. Don't report on the young women.
Jeffrey Epstein would terrorize people.
Vanity Fair eagerly dissected the missteps and foibles of society's elites and eagerly rubbed shoulders with them. And for years, Graydon Carter led the way on both. In 2002, Carter assigned a reporter to find out more about Jeffrey Epstein. Just who is this enigmatic financier, and why is he flying around with Bill Clinton and other celebrities? Here's that reporter, Vicky Ward.
At the time, it was two-pronged. The mystery about Jeffrey Epstein was how he had made his money.
Ward spoke on Morning Edition last month.
It was also known that he would gather New York's rich and famous for dinner parties at his home, but there would be these very young women. The women were always part of the Jeffrey Epstein story.
In March 2003, Vanity Fair did publish a piece by Ward taking a tough look at Epstein's lavish lifestyle and questioning the origins of his fortune. Connolly says Carter soon called to share an ominous development.
The day it came out, there was a live bullet put on Graydon's, his outside his house in Manhattan.
Even in the absence of any evidence Epstein was involved, Connolly tells NPR that both Carter and he considered the bullet a clear warning.
That wasn't a coincidence.
Another former colleague tells NPR of a similarly anguished call from Carter about the bullet. In statements to NPR, Carter says the magazine never held back on Epstein because of any sense of threat or intimidation. Instead, Carter says Ward's reporting did not pass the legal threshold for publication. He says Vanity Fair took legal requirements seriously, especially when the subject was a private person who's therefore rigorously protected under libel laws. And he said Ward did not have 3 sources who met the magazine's legal threshold. For the first time, however, Maria and Annie Farmer are confirming publicly they spoke to Vicky Ward on the record in 2002. Their mother, Janice Farmer, says she did too. And they tell NPR they were crestfallen Vanity Fair didn't report their allegations of exploitation.
I think it made it more difficult to not only get victims to speak out, but to get witnesses to speak out.
David Boyes is a lawyer for the Farmer sisters.
It was discouraging. I think it helped create the impression among many of the victims that the media was under Epstein's control, that Epstein had all this power.
By late 2006, John Connolly says he was interviewing other women in South Florida to see if there was another story for Vanity Fair to do as authorities investigated Epstein. Connolly tells me Carter soon received another shock.
Let me stop you right there. When you said a dead cat's head was put outside Graydon Carter's house?
It was put on the stoop of his home up in the country. It was done to intimidate, no question about it.
And it worked.
Yeah, it did.
Connolly says Carter called him to express anxiety for the safety of his children. Others tell NPR the dead cat was the talk of the office. And Connolly says he voluntarily stopped pursuing the subject for Vanity Fair.
Well, it's natural to ask how someone like Epstein can get away with that. Sure, he's rich, but so was Bill Cosby. Being Speaker of the House of Representatives did not save Denny Hastert. It's very interesting. We've all heard the saying about journalism, the old saying, if it bleeds, it leads, meaning the news media is biased toward sensationalism in general. But if that's true, if they're just looking for sensationalism, it's fair to wonder why every newspaper in the land does not have investigative teams devoted to the Jeffrey Epstein story. Billionaire playboy with deep connections to the rich and powerful running a massive multi-state underage sex trafficking operation. Corroborated accounts from accusers about very well-known people being involved. A federal prosecutor saying he was told to back off by his superiors because Epstein belongs to intelligence. I mean, at the height of the Me Too purge, news outlets devoted teams of reporters to investigating important people for anything that might get them another scalp. The combination of gossip column salaciousness and reader interest with the conferred seriousness of reporting that was part of a movement for gender equality, it was just too good to pass up. But if there was ever a target-rich environment for media outlets fighting tooth and nail for audience share, it's the Jeffrey Epstein story. But no corporate news outlet seems to want anything to do with it. How could that be? It's not that they've looked deeply into it and just concluded that there's nothing there worth further investigation. That didn't happen. And in any case, that's never stopped them before if they think they've got a story with the kind of guaranteed ratings that Epstein brings. Again, there have been some really beloved and powerful people. Think Denny Hastert, who, if you're a little younger and unaware, Denny Hastert is the highest-ranking U.S. official ever to serve a prison sentence. He was the Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, so second in line to the presidency, right behind the vice president. Guy with the same juice that Nancy Pelosi carries today. You don't get to a position like Speaker of the House by public acclamation. It's not an American Idol vote by phone kind of thing. The people who get fingered for positions at that level come in 2 types. They've either spent decades building a very powerful social network so that when they're jostling with other power players who want that position, they've got more artillery to call in for backup. Or they're puppets or frontmen put up by others who think that they can control things from behind the scenes. Denny Hastert was a bit of both. He was a very powerful guy in Washington, but he was easy to control for anyone who knew his secret, which was that Speaker of the House of Representatives Denny Hastert was a, quote, serial child molester, in the words of the judge who eventually sentenced him to prison. Now, this was not in the early 1800s or something, by the way, folks. This was the Speaker of the House until 2007. Isn't that interesting? With all the mud that's flung back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. I mean, they call each other traitor, terrorist, murderer, Nazi, communist. And so isn't it weird that almost nobody even remembers that the most powerful Republican congressman was in prison for molesting children less than 15 years ago? You think the Democrats would be just be carpet bombing that fact all over the place, reminding us every day about it and with some justice. And this is a guy, Hastert, who built his early political career on this image of being a teacher and a coach and a mentor to young boys, and he was a straight-up predator. But nobody wants to talk about it. It's one of the things that nobody really wants to talk about, to the point that most people, if you bring it up, and even people who remember it from the time, they're like, oh yeah, they kind of remember it, but it's faded out of public memory. I can understand why people don't want to talk about it. I don't really want to talk about any of this stuff either. But maybe the people who should be talking about it are worried that if the public starts asking some pretty basic questions, like how does a literal serial child molester rise through the ranks for decades to become the most powerful man in Congress without anybody noticing what he was up to? Why, when he was caught, did he get 13 months in prison when we routinely give decades to drug offenders and people running, Ponzi schemes and financial schemes? Or think about Bill Cosby, who I mentioned, or even Tiger Woods or Harvey Weinstein. When the eye of Sauron turned its gaze in their direction, that was it for them. Not to compare Tiger to what the other two were accused of, but just in the sense that there was this embarrassing scandal, this devastating scandal, and it didn't matter that they were rich or powerful or had powerful friends or that a lot of people were invested in their success. It did not matter. And you think about this. If Bill Gates or Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos got hauled in with dozens of underage girls accusing them of sexual assault, each of them independently corroborating the other's accounts that sync up with flight logs and visitor records and known travel of other people that they say were present, sure, those guys would have certain advantages, like being able to hire the most expensive lawyers, or maybe being able to intimidate the girls into silence, or just benefiting from some residual public goodwill if it goes to trial. But if they couldn't keep those girls quiet, and they couldn't intimidate them, and they didn't have a good story to explain their corroborated accounts, those guys would be on their way to prison. And also, they'd be in the headlines every day because it's a crazy story with guaranteed public interest. And so the obvious question is, how is it that this guy, Jeffrey Epstein, who's rich and prominent, but he's not Bill Gates rich and prominent. Maybe he was in control of a couple $2 billion, and not all of it his, which is a lot, but it's not the kind of money that can put the U.S. Department of Justice off you when there's dozens of underage girls willing to testify that you sexually assaulted them. How is it that this guy seems to be able to dictate terms to the U.S. Department of Justice? These are the people who took down John Gotti and Denny Hastert and Pablo Escobar. They weren't afraid to do that. This is Amy Robach from ABC News, an anchor on the news show 2020. You may have heard this. It was released by Project Veritas a couple years ago.
I've had the story for 3 years. I've had this interview with Virginia Roberts. We would not put it on the air. First of all, I was told, who's Jeffrey Epstein? No one knows who that is. This is a stupid story. Then the palace found out that we had her whole allegations about Prince Andrew and threatened us a million different ways. We were so afraid we wouldn't be able to interview Kate and Will that also quashed the story. And then Alan Dershowitz was also implicated in it because of the planes. She told me everything. She had pictures. She had everything. She was in hiding for 12 years. We convinced her to come out. We convinced her to talk to us. It was unbelievable what we had. Clinton. We had everything. I tried for 3 years to get it on. to no avail, and now it's all coming out, and it's like these new revelations, and I freaking had all of it. I'm so pissed right now. Like, every day I get more and more pissed because I'm just like, oh my God, what we had was unreal. Other women backing it up. Hey, yep. Brad Edwards, the attorney, 3 years ago, saying there will come a day when we will realize Jeffrey Epstein was the most prolific pedophile this country has ever known. And I had it all 3 years ago. So do I think he was killed? 100%. Yes, I do. Because he made his whole living blackmailing people. Yeah. There were a lot of men in those planes, a lot of men who visited that island, a lot of powerful men who came into that apartment. When I heard he was found in his cell, I knew immediately. And they made it seem as though he made that suicide attempt 2 weeks earlier, but his lawyers claimed that he was roughed up by his cellmate around the neck. That was all like to plant the seed, and then that's why I really believe it. Like, really believe it.
See, now we're getting somewhere. Who would have enough juice to suppress a story like this? Maybe not Bill Gates, but maybe the Queen of England. Maybe a guy like Bill Clinton, who was groomed for his role early on, first as a Rhodes Scholar and then at Georgetown, where he studied under Carroll Quigley with Prince Turki al-Faisal in his class, the longtime head of Saudi intelligence. And Bill Clinton was in deep with the CIA in the 80s when Colombian drug lords were flying their cocaine into Arkansas when he was governor there. And so maybe a guy like that. And Epstein was not powerful himself, but he had backing from some of the most powerful networks in the world, partly because, as Amy Robach said, he likely had some very dark blackmail on some very important people, and partly because of who he was gathering that blackmail for, which I think is the much more interesting and fruitful question. So let's dig into that. Anytime you're dealing with questions involving intelligence agencies, you are going to find yourself wading through a lot of circumstantial evidence. You'll run into the same thing if you try to investigate the intelligence agency's more rambunctious cousins, organized crime syndicates. And that's by design. Everybody has a vested interest in keeping secrets. They know what happens to people who don't. And so you're not going to find written orders with signatures and detailed explanations of each party's role in the conspiracy. The evidence that Jeffrey Epstein was working with an intelligence agency is mostly circumstantial. It's likely to stay that way. But cases can be built on circumstantial evidence if it piles up high enough that the burden is shifted to the other side to make their case for why this is all one giant string of coincidences and misunderstandings. I'm working on this while the jury is still deliberating the fate of Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell was Jeffrey Epstein's occasional girlfriend, apparently, and according to federal prosecutors and many of his accusers, she helped recruit and groom young girls to be abused by Jeffrey Epstein, and that she would also participate in the abuse herself. That's what she's on trial for. A lot of people were hoping the Maxwell trial would bring out a bit of the truth that died with Jeffrey Epstein in his prison cell. But, really, this courtroom is not the place to make that case. And so those people have been disappointed. If the prosecution starts veering off the main case, namely 4 known, identifiable, on-the-record victims of Epstein, as well as people who know them, testifying that Maxwell participated in sexual abuse to get that conviction, and they start talking about Prince Andrew and Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, or what that guy meant when he said Epstein belonged to intelligence, Ghislaine Maxwell is not charged with any of that. And the job of investigating those related matters should, in an ideal world, or at least a moderately functional one, fall to the news media. And maybe to the legitimate counterintelligence mission of the FBI, but this world is, of course, neither ideal nor functional, so instead you get me. There are researchers who have done a lot of legwork on the Epstein story. People like Whitney Webb and Ryan Dawson. If you're familiar with the work of those people, you're not going to learn really anything new here. I'm trying to put everything together in one place to kind of give people a brief. And, if you've read whole books on this topic and everything, there's going to be things in here that I leave out. Just want to hit a lot of the key points to give people a baseline understanding of what we know and can reasonably infer about this situation. It's only been very recently that some mainstream sources were forced to admit that there are some interesting questions here. Rolling Stone ran a story that was headlined, "Was Jeffrey Epstein a Spy?" It was written by our friend Vicky Ward, formerly of Vanity Fair. Quote, "Back in 2002, when I was reporting on Jeffrey Epstein's finances for Vanity Fair magazine, he was not a household name. During that time, I paid a visit to the Federal Medical Center, Devens and Devens, Massachusetts, to meet with an inmate, one Stephen Hoffenberg. We sat in a little room near a recreation area, Hoffenberg dressed in the requisite orange jumpsuit, while I, several months pregnant with twins, was dressed per prison requirements, as shapelessly as possible. It was an absolutely intriguing meeting. Hoffenberg was serving 18 years in prison for committing a $450 million Ponzi scheme. In the 1980s, he'd been running Towers Financial, a debt collection and reinsurance business, and had worked alongside Epstein, who was a paid consultant. Hoffenberg told me that Epstein planned to turn Towers into a global colossus through illegal means. Hoffenberg told me with a sad grin that he represented a problem for Epstein because while they were working together, Epstein had confided in him as to how exactly he made a career out of conning people and institutions, not least because the idea was that they would do it together. Hoffenberg said that Epstein had a term for the perfect execution of the grift. He called it playing the box, which meant that he ensured that even if his crime was uncovered, the victim would be unable to do anything about it, either because of social embarrassment or because the money was tucked away in a place where they couldn't find or couldn't get it. This interview is from 2002, just before anybody knew who Epstein was. What Hoffenberg had failed to realize, he told me, is that Epstein would con him. Epstein would take $100 million of Towers' money, move it offshore, and meanwhile cooperate with U.S. prosecutors against Hoffenberg, who was unable to do anything about this because he'd pleaded guilty, which meant that there was no trial and therefore no discovery. I can't prove all of Hoffenberg's claims, but some of them are accurate. I have discovered, for example, that Epstein certainly did cooperate against Hoffenberg and gave at least 3 interviews to prosecutors, and that had the case gone to trial, a source with knowledge says it would have likely turned out far worse for Epstein than for Hoffenberg. Hoffenberg also knew something else Epstein wanted hidden, according to Hoffenberg. He claimed that Epstein moved in intelligence circles. End quote. So this is in 2002. Before Epstein was ever arrested the first time or the second time, before any accusations about him had publicly surfaced. And his business partner, he and Hoffenberg worked closely for several years, is telling a reporter back in 2002 that Epstein was connected to intelligence agencies. It would be just 5 or 6 years later, in 2007 or 2008, that the federal prosecutor down in Florida, who was overseeing Epstein's case, Alex Acosta, was told, according to his sworn testimony, that he was told by his superiors to back off of Epstein because Epstein, quote, belongs to intelligence. Back to Ward, quote, the Hoffenberg-Epstein relationship was not something Epstein, then pitching himself to Vanity Fair as a money manager extraordinaire for billionaires only, had volunteered to me. So when I gingerly raised Hoffenberg to Epstein and mentioned that I had documentation showing that the two were linked, the financier turned really nasty. He maintained he hardly knew Hoffenberg. He just consulted briefly on a couple of deals, that he'd not been involved in any prosecution of Hoffenberg, and that if I wrote any different, things would turn out badly for me. Here's exactly what he said. If there's any implication of wrongdoing, I will take legal action against you personally. I'm telling you so you understand. I will be as harsh as I possibly can personally. Not for the magazine, but you, because I had this discussion with you. This relationship is with you. You shouldn't risk your future for a job. And back to Ward. Now, Epstein's sensitivity regarding Hoffenberg was equal to his sensitivity on what he called the girls. He went berserk if you mentioned either subject. In hindsight, one has to wonder if Hoffenberg presented an equally big problem as the girls would. Hoffenberg told me that in the 1980s, after Epstein left Bear Stearns in ignominious circumstances, Epstein was trained in moving money offshore and that a mentor of Epstein's was someone Hoffenberg knew, a British defense contractor who died in 2011 named Douglas Leese. Hoffenberg claimed that Leese was an arms dealer. Leese's son Julian says that's not true, but the UK parliamentary record does mention Leese in reference to the Al Yamama arms deal of the early 1980s. I remember distinctly that in our first meeting, Hoffenberg told me that Leese was pivotal in understanding Jeffrey's M.O., because Leese had introduced him not only to aristocratic Europeans, who Epstein subsequently fleeced, but to all sorts of people in the arms business, including the late Turkish-born businessman Adnan Khashoggi, and, allegedly, the late media mogul Robert Maxwell. Back in 2002, I didn't pay much attention to this. This was because Epstein breezily threw me off. First, Epstein told me he'd never met Maxwell, and I asked him twice if he knew Leese, whom I had never heard of, and Epstein said no. The second time he elaborated. Douglas Leese. I think he was the father of somebody I knew. I think his son was friendly with Ferranti. That's where that whole crowd comes in that you asked me about a long time ago. I think his name was Nicholas. It was sort of that 66th Street building. I think they might have all lived there. So I forgot about Leese, and I didn't bother to pursue the notion that Epstein had known Maxwell. End quote. Those three people that Miss Ward just mentioned, Douglas Leese, Adnan Khashoggi, and Robert Maxwell, those names will be familiar to people who have spent some time researching the deep politics of the late 70s and throughout the 1980s. Sir Douglas Leese was a British arms broker, kind of a backroom deal maker, as well as an agent of British intelligence, according to Stephen Hoffenberg and others, who knew Leese and Epstein at the time back in the 80s when they were associated. Leese is supposed to have been one of the key brokers of the largest arms deal in UK history with Saudi Arabia. It took place back in the 1980s. Leese worked with a Saudi counterpart, another sort of guy who operated in the shadows in those liminal spaces, between sovereign entities, another arms broker named Adnan Khashoggi, who we just mentioned. And Khashoggi was this larger-than-life sort of caricature of a decadent Arabian prince. He's not a Saudi prince, but just throwing around a ton of money, everything gold, everything big. Donald Trump actually bought his yacht after Khashoggi eventually went to jail later on. And his last name should sound familiar. He's the uncle of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was murdered and chopped up by Saudi agents in the kingdom's embassy in Turkey in 2018. So this is a family that's close to power. Khashoggi was very close to both Saudi and Israeli intelligence, and he almost served as an almost official go-between for the two governments, kind of an off-the-books diplomat. Back in the 1980s, when the Reagan administration wanted to get weapons illegally to Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, they asked Israel for help because Israel shared the same interest. Obviously Israel and Iran hate each other now, but back then, right after the revolution, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, what they were really worried about was Saddam Hussein and him getting too powerful if he conquered too much of it. So yeah, the Reagan administration wanted to get weapons to Iran to prolong the war. They asked Israel for help. And what does Israel do? Israel calls on the services of Adnan Khashoggi to make it happen. Both Khashoggi and Leese were the kind of guys that you called when you were a government that needed something done, but done discreetly. Lease was the bagman bringing bribes to Saudi and British officials to make sure that the right companies got paid off in their big arms deal. Adnan Khashoggi was an arms trafficker with connections all over the world who knew how to work around things like customs agents and national borders. Well, Epstein gets close with both of these guys in the 1980s. He worked with both of them. And based on the above ground information, it's kind of hard to see what it is exactly that he would have been doing with them. Epstein was already on a private plane headed to a meeting at the Pentagon with Douglas Lease in 1981, when Epstein is just 28 years old and hasn't done anything, really, when you look at his actual resume up to that point. I mean, let's take a moment, and it will only take a moment because there's not much here, to review what we know about Epstein up to this point in his life. In 1981, when he's on that plane with Douglas Lease, Epstein had just left his job at the investment firm Bear Stearns after only 5 years. And he left under a cloud due to a regulatory violation. He was forced out. In a deposition years later, investigators were hammering Epstein with questions about insider trading all the way to the CEO of the company. Well, before working at Bear Stearns, he had worked for 2 years teaching high school math, a job that he left amidst complaints that he was being inappropriate with his female students, surprise, surprise. And that's it. That's his resume up to this point. He's a college dropout, but somehow got hired to teach mathematics at Dalton School, an elite private school in New York, who presumably could hire any high school math teacher in the country, but went with this guy who had no college degree and no experience teaching. One of his students was the child of Ace Greenberg, who's a pretty well-known vice president at Bear Stearns, a big investment bank. And Epstein's supposed to have befriended Greenberg and talked his way into a Wall Street job. So he apparently starts out as a junior trader, but soon gets moved into a different area with the firm. Bear Stearns CEO Jimmy Kane, who remained close to Epstein years later, and who ran his shop in a way that Epstein would have appreciated, said, quote, "He was not your conventional broker saying, buy IBM or sell Xerox. Given his mathematical background, we put him in our special products division, where he would advise our wealthier clients on the tax implications of their portfolios. He would recommend certain tax advantageous transactions. He's a very smart guy and has become a very important client for the firm as well." End quote. So let me translate that for the kids in the back. Epstein's job at Bear Stearns was to help rich people hide their money. And he did it for some very rich and some very important people, like Charles Bronfman, a billionaire from the Seagram's liquor fortune, whose name will come up again later. And so that probably explains why Epstein maintained a strong relationship with Bear Stearns and personally with Jimmy Kane and Ace Greenberg, even after being forced out of the company for attracting the attention of regulators, because he got caught doing exactly what they were paying him to do. Maybe he got a little overzealous with it. And so now a picture, the beginnings of a picture, starts to emerge. Why would high-powered arms brokers like Douglas Lease be on a private plane headed to a meeting at the Pentagon with a 28-year-old college dropout, a failed high school math teacher, and junior trader who just got fired from his investment banking job? He's there because he's not looking for a math tutor or for investment advice. He's looking for someone who knows how to hide and launder money. And that's what Epstein had spent 5 years at Bear Stearns learning how to do. In later interviews, Epstein was always coy about his business during this period, but he was more open with it with people who knew him back in the past. He said he was a financial bounty hunter. That's what he was employed as after he left Bear Stearns for a few years in the early 80s. He was a financial bounty hunter. A guy named Jesse Kornbluth, who was friends with Epstein in the 1980s, says that Epstein told him that he consulted for governments and companies and wealthy individuals to help them recover stolen money, and that he also sometimes worked with people who had stolen a lot of money to help them hide it. Another guy who knew Epstein in the 1980s says basically the same thing. Epstein told him he was a financial bounty hunter who specialized at hiding and finding money, and he also said that Epstein was one way or another connected to intelligence agencies. Well, Epstein had concocted this ridiculous story about what he was up to in those years after he left Bear Stearns and started managing money himself. He said his firm only accepted accounts of $1 billion or more, which is just absurd. You know, this guy's under 30 years old. He has no track record. No one's ever heard of any big trades he's made, but to even get him on the phone, you not only have to be a billionaire, but you have to have $1 billion to invest just with him. It's just so stupid. I mean, one Wall Street guy who knew him back then tells a story about how he thought one time that he would do Epstein a solid. And so a wealthy friend of his was looking for a money manager to manage over $600 million for him. And so this guy offered to set Epstein up with him, but Epstein turned him down. Not because his client list was full or he was too busy, but because the account was just too small for him to bother with. Now, that's just obviously absurd. Someone with $600 million to invest doesn't audition for his money manager. They audition for him. Especially in the 1980s, that's like $1.5 billion now. If you go to Goldman Sachs with $1.5 billion to invest, the CEO of the firm will greet you at the door before taking you on his private elevator to a conference room where vice presidents of the company will give you a presentation explaining how you're going to have a whole team of analysts and traders assigned specifically to your account, and how they're going to be able to draw on data and intelligence streams from around the world, and how he'll be first in line for lucrative private investments and IPOs and mergers that are handled by Goldman Sachs. You know, this is the kind of red carpet treatment you could expect at the most powerful investment bank in the country if you showed up with that kind of money. And supposedly this random guy who nobody really knows, who's been managing money for a few years on his own supposedly, just blows it off like it's beneath his notice. It's just silly. And I think it's pretty obvious what was going on, which is that he didn't want the account because Jeffrey Epstein was not really running a hedge fund. People went around to players on Wall Street after the whole Epstein story blew up and asked people who know, have any of you guys ever worked with this dude? Do you know anyone who has worked with him or done a deal with him? Have you heard of any big deals he's done or big trades he's made? Someone like Epstein, just to explain to some of you who aren't familiar with this world, someone like this guy who is supposedly managing enough money for billionaires that his personal fees, which are often kind of 1% of the year's profit, is kind of standard. So if you're managing $1 billion and the investments make 10%, 10% of $1 billion is $100 million. You as the manager get 1% of that. So $1 million that year. Well, Epstein's making way more than $1 million. He's got the largest private residence in New York City. It's 9 stories tall, like 40 or 50,000 square feet. It's worth $70 million. He's got the largest private residence in the state of New Mexico on a 7,500-acre ranch. He's got a private island with a temple on it, a fleet of aircraft, more homes all over the world. And he was supposedly a billionaire, but you don't become a billionaire making $10 million or $20 million a year. That's not going to get you there. To get the kind of money that Epstein was showing, and to get it in a relatively short period of time, really just less than a decade, 6 or 7 years, and he seems to be fully ramped up, you'd have to be making moves in the market that the whole world would see happening. Billionaires don't add a few shares of Microsoft to their E-Trade accounts. Billionaires take a position in the company, meaning they have meetings with various brokers who pull together enough shares and structure the purchase in a way that doesn't absorb all the liquidity and make the market go bonkers. Well, you don't do that for years without anyone else on Wall Street working with you, or knowing anyone who worked with you, or knowing about any deals or trades you've made, or anybody who worked for you. A hedge fund is not just a guy at his computer making trades either. Hedge funds have offices full of analysts and traders and economists and mathematicians and accountants, you name it. It's a company. It's a whole operation. Epstein didn't have any of that, as far as we're aware. From Miss Ward's 2003 article, quote, "Why do billionaires choose him as their trustee? Because the problems of the mega rich, he tells people, are different from yours and mine. And his unique philosophy is central to understanding those problems." This is Epstein. "Very few people need any more money when they have $1 billion. The key is to not have it do more harm than anything else. You don't want to lose your money." End quote. Well, again, a billionaire can have anybody manage his money. Okay, the biggest and most powerful firms in the world would fight over his account. But they're supposedly giving it to this nobody who got pushed out of his firm for a regulatory violation, and where he wasn't even working as a trader but a special products engineer, a field in which he'd be much more limited on his own without the institutional backing. And they're not giving it because he's just so brilliant and this eccentric genius who just has some intuition. He's going to double our money. Therefore, we're going to take a risk by giving our $1 billion to this guy. No, it's just they're giving it to him just because they want to preserve what they have. Well, that's just not how the world works. You give your money to any investment bank in the world and say, structure this in a conservative way that's going to make sure it's robust to turbulence and inflation and that I just don't lose what I have. Any investment bank in the world can do that for you. That's not why you go to a guy like Jeffrey Epstein. In the real world, you go to a guy like Jeffrey Epstein to get things done that you don't want anybody else knowing about. And it's easy to think of money laundering like it's sort of an afterthought to the criminal underworld. This boring but necessary appendage to the real crimes, But money laundering is as central to organized crime as it is to intelligence operations. Nothing happens without it. When you're running some off-the-books operation like, I don't know, illegally selling weapons to Iran in order to raise money to illegally supply the Nicaraguan Contras, but it's not like Iran can just wire $800 million to the CIA's checking account. These are massive sums of money that are really only dealt with by institutions, and you've got to move it around across board. I mean, think about like a 4-foot high pallet of cash of $100 bills is about $50 million. So moving around this kind of money, you have to be able to do it through institutions. And if you're doing that, then you're risking having it detected and tracked by people you don't want seeing it. You got to move it around again across borders without anyone knowing, or if they find out, to make sure that there's a great, legitimate sounding story, at least on first pass, about where this money came from and what it's doing. This is what Epstein learned to do at Bear Stearns. It's what he did there. And it helps explain why he was on a private plane with Douglas Leese the same year that Bear Stearns dropped him. It also helps explain why Leese would introduce him to another big arms dealer like Adnan Khashoggi. Guys like that don't need a banker. They've got bankers. But they always need good money launderers. Now, the third name that I mentioned a few minutes ago was Robert Maxwell, the British publishing mogul. Douglas Leese introduced Epstein to Maxwell in the mid-1980s, and after getting to know him for a couple years, Robert Maxwell introduced Epstein to his favorite daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell. This was in 1988. Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, as is now well known, became lovers and confidants and partners in crime. But she also seems to have had a role assigned to her by her father as a sort of all-in-one manager or handler of Jeffrey Epstein. Through her father, she had access to the wealthy and powerful people that we now associate with Epstein, guys like Prince Andrew or the Clintons or whatever. It was through Ghislaine that he got to know these people. And she seems to have been something like his, social manager. She would make connections and set him up with people, bring him to parties and events and manage his calendar. And his job was to show up and be Jeffrey Epstein, I guess. And her job was to set everything up and kind of manage the situation. Well, her father Robert Maxwell, is a very interesting guy. A lot of people don't remember him today, especially in the U.S., or if they do, it's only because he's the father of the notorious Ghislaine Maxwell. But he was one of the most famous men in Britain and one of the wealthiest and most connected men on planet Earth until his mysterious death in 1981. Robert Maxwell's birth name was Abraham Lieb, and it would change a dozen times throughout his life. When he was 15, his name was Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hoch, and Nazi Germany had just annexed a large chunk of his home country of Czechoslovakia. The next year, Hungary absorbed what was left, and Jan, coming from an Orthodox Jewish family, sees the writing on the wall, and so he escapes to France in May 1940, where he joins up with the Czechoslovakian army in exile just in time for France to be overrun by the Germans. And so Jan is forced to escape again, this time to England, posing as a French soldier and using a surname that he copped from a brand of French cigarettes. He's a very resourceful guy, especially as a young man, 16, 17-year-old kid. Once he gets to England, he links up with Czechoslovak and Zionist groups there, but eventually becomes frustrated with the Czechoslovak government in exile, and so he joins up with the British military, first in engineering corps, and then in 1943 he hooks up with a combat unit that saw action from the Normandy invasion all the way to Berlin. And he saw plenty of combat. He also participated in ugly business like interrogating captured Nazis. Later, he'd be implicated in a war crimes investigation for murdering unarmed German civilians. In January 1945, just a few months before the war's end, he was pinned by British General Bernard Montgomery with a military cross for storming a machine gun nest. The Military Cross was the second highest British military award at the time, same as a Distinguished Service Cross or a Navy Cross in the U.S. It's a high award. Jan made sergeant during the war and then received an officer's commission at the rank of captain right as the war was wrapping up in 1945. Well, again, you can tell this guy's a hustler. Okay, escapes 2 countries, has 5 or 6 names, joins 2 armies, and fights his way through France to Germany all before his 25th birthday. And the guy's a hustler and a grinder, and he gets things done when he sets his mind to it. After the war, Jan was attached to the British Foreign Office and spent the next 2 years working for the British government's PR and propaganda outfit in Berlin, where they put his considerable language skills to work. According to one of his biographers later, he was eventually fluent in 9 languages, which, I don't know, maybe that's a bit exaggerated, but certainly he spoke at least 4 or 5. In 1946, he was naturalized as a British citizen, and he used the contacts that he made during the war, as well as those that he had from before the war back in Eastern Europe, to start up an import-export business between the UK and the East. Now, most, if not all, of Jan Hoch's immediate family had been killed during the war. And like many Jews at the time, he was looking to Palestine as the only permanent solution to their troubles in Europe and elsewhere. Well, Zionism presented a bit of a problem because it ran headlong into official British interests and policy after the war. After facilitating it for years, Britain had begun severely restricting Jewish immigration to Palestine just before the outbreak of war because of the terrible effects that the emerging Jewish-Palestinian conflict was having on Britain's relations with the Arab countries. And they continued this policy, more or less, after the war. By this point, the Zionists in Palestine believe that they're ready to handle the Arabs on their own, if only the British would simply get out of the country. But it never was the official British policy to hand Palestine over to Jewish control, and they'd spent a lot of time and money fighting for and developing the region over the years, so the British were not eager to be driven off. And so to help motivate them, Zionist terrorists began attacking British personnel in Palestine and assassinating British officials in other countries. They blew up the British headquarters at the King David Hotel, killing 91 people. They sent mail bombs to British officials back in England. They even sent a mail bomb to the White House addressed to President Truman, according to a memoir written by the man who served as the head of the White House mailroom under 6 presidents, and an account that's confirmed by Truman's own daughter in her memoir. You're martyr-made listeners, so you already know this story. The Zionists still had their boosters in the British government, but by the late 40s, relations had deteriorated enough that things were difficult, especially on the ground. There was a great deal of hatred passing between the British and the Zionists there in Palestine. So that when the British were finally driven out of the country in 1948, they were very bitter about it, and they slapped a weapons embargo on the emerging Israeli state just as war was coming with its Arab neighbors. So to get people and weapons into Palestine, the Zionists were going to have to work through unofficial channels to get around the British blockade, and they drew on every thread that they could reach. For example, Lyndon Johnson, U.S. president after Kennedy, a Jewish historian from Texas named Louis Gamelak, studied LBJ's early relationship with the Zionists, which went way back. His aunt was a founding member of the Zionist Organization of America. And Gamelak found evidence that LBJ and his friend Jim Novy, who was a wealthy Zionist down there in Texas where LBJ operated, were involved together in smuggling weapons into Palestine in crates that were marked for Texas grapefruit. And Gamelak doesn't really explain how the smuggling was accomplished, but it was not a U.S. government operation. It was something LBJ was doing on his own in violation of American law. Raising the money to buy large quantities of military hardware and getting that hardware off the books and then shipping it halfway around the world to a country under embargo by the British, that's a major operation, okay? That's handled by not just some guy that you met down at the bar. This is going to be handled by established smuggling outfits. And if you're talking about smuggling in the midst of the total destruction of commerce and infrastructure following the Second World War, you're going to be dealing with organized crime. And it was helpful that Jewish mobsters in the United States and other countries tended to be sympathetic to the Zionists because, well, partly because both groups were at war in different ways with the communists. Another string that the Zionists pulled on was that of a young Jewish war veteran turned import-export businessman from Czechoslovakia, exactly the kind of person who would know how to get things from one place to another in the complicated post-war environment. The new communist government in Prague made an agreement to ship weapons, many of them seized from the Germans, to the Zionists in exchange for cash, but they still needed a way to get the gear down to Palestine, and that's where men like our current protagonist, Jan Hoch, who got things from one place to another for a living, came in. The weapon shipments from Czechoslovakia that were facilitated by Jan Hoch at the time were considered decisive in that first war against the Arabs, the Israeli War of Independence, especially because of the aircraft they delivered, aircraft which were the specific smuggling assignment of Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hoch. Or actually, he had officially changed his name to better fit into British society by this point, so we will call him by his new name now, Robert Maxwell. In 1951, Maxwell, still only 28 years old, really amazing when you think about it, he bought a small publisher of scientific books, and he gained the US and UK distribution rights for a much larger continental European publisher of scientific books. I don't know too many of the details of these businesses in the early days, but according to at least 2 of his biographers, Maxwell had an effective monopoly editing and distributing scientific and engineering journals being translated into English out of Germany and other European countries. And before long, he had built the company into a major publishing house and had become extremely wealthy. In the 1960s, he runs for and wins a seat in the House of Commons. In the early 1980s, he buys a group of 6 newspapers, including the Daily Mirror. A few years later, he buys Macmillan, one of the big 5 English-language publishers. He bought the New York Daily News. He tried with the billionaire Charles Bronfman of the Seagram's liquor fortune to buy the Jerusalem Post. By the end of the 1980s, Robert Maxwell was one of the most famous men in Britain. He was one of the world's most well-known publishers, and his empire was vast. His net worth, according to Forbes, was in the $1 to $2 billion range, which is maybe $4 or $5 billion today. At a time when there were a lot fewer billionaires, like now every rando hedge fund manager, college dropout computer programmer has $1 billion. That was not how it was back then. Was a combat veteran, a businessman, a linguist, a smuggler, and an experienced propagandist with contacts across Europe, including behind the Iron Curtain, as well as in Britain and the Middle East. Robert Maxwell was obviously very interesting to intelligence agencies after the war and throughout his life. The British Foreign Office and the FBI, for a while, suspected that he might have been working for the Russians, but most people who have researched the topic think this was probably a misunderstanding. Robert Maxwell, it's hard to relate to a guy like this. He was really this larger-than-life international figure who seemed to have almost perceived himself as a sovereign country. After all, the leaders of actual sovereign countries kowtow to him all the time, call on him to ask for favors and beg for his support and to draw on his connections around the world. He's not calling them for help, they're calling him for help. And it's definitely true that Maxwell was doing things for the KGB and the Czechoslovakian communists in the 1960s, as did his friend Geoffrey Robinson, a former British MP who's been described as Maxwell's bagman during that same period of time. But Maxwell, I think, would not have felt like he was an asset of Soviet intelligence because he was not some normal citizen. He would have seen himself more like the way he was actually treated, which was as a sort of freelance, unofficial diplomat who he's a British citizen, but really he kind of exists in the liminal spaces between these established power structures. The FBI and British Foreign Office probably saw Maxwell sneaking around Eastern Europe, meeting with Soviet and KGB officials, and thought he might be working on their behalf, but we know today that Maxwell only served two masters, himself and the Zionist State of Israel. His association with Israeli intelligence began with smuggling weapons in the immediate post-war years, and over the years his role grew. As someone who had planes, yachts, contacts across the world, access to important people, and legitimate business interests to provide excuses for international travel and meetings, the Mossad, the Israeli Mossad, put Robert Maxwell to many uses over the years. If the Mossad needed to get a message to the head of the KGB without generating an official record, Maxwell delivered it. If the Mossad needed money for an operation, but it couldn't be seen as coming from them, Maxwell would arrange to make it happen. And in general, he would just keep his eyes and ears, as well as the eyes and ears of the reporters working for him, open for anything that might be of interest to Israeli intelligence. In 1991, a man named Ari Ben Menashe approached several British news organizations with some stories about Robert Maxwell. Ben Menashe was an arms dealer and a 10-year veteran of Israeli military intelligence. And he claimed that Maxwell and his foreign editor at the Daily Mirror, Nicholas Davies, were both longtime Mossad agents, and that, among other things, Maxwell had informed the Israeli government of the identity of the Israeli whistleblower, Mordecai Vanunu, in 1986, after Vanunu approached one of Maxwell's papers with evidence exposing Israel's long-denied nuclear program. Ben Menashe also claimed that Maxwell had helped set a honey trap that led to Vanunu being kidnapped in Rome, then shipped off to Israel and thrown in prison. And he also claimed that Robert Maxwell had played a role in what became known as the Iran-Contra affair of the Reagan administration. I remember several years ago, in my former life with the Department of Defense, one time we all had to attend a training evolution on how to recognize an insider threat, meaning a fellow DoD employee or contractor who might leak classified information to foreign governments or other parties that the U.S. government would not want to have it. They tell us to watch out for people who suddenly start showing a lot of money, or people who are known to gamble a lot or who owe a lot of money, things that might cause them to want to do something like sell military secrets to another country. As part of this training, they went through maybe a dozen real-life historical examples of people who had done this, like in recent decades, so that we could see the patterns and kind of get a profile of what to look for. But there's this strange, awkward elephant in the room. Out of the dozen or so real-life examples they covered, all but 2, maybe 3, shared one very obvious characteristic that nobody was mentioning, namely that almost all of these espionage examples that they provided were carried out by Americans of certain ethnic origins who were leaking secrets to their ancestral homeland out of a feeling of national duty or pride. And as they go through 3, 4 examples, 7, 8, 9 examples where this pattern holds, it's becoming a little awkward in the room because there's an obvious question to be asked, but one that no one doing this training really wants to answer. Well, leave it to me. Everyone knows I'm a bit of a troll, but, my trolling usually has a purpose. The entertainment that I get out of it's just sort of a side effect. Or maybe if I'm being honest, one of the side effects of entertaining myself is that some actual purpose is also served. I like to think so. And so I raise my hand and I point out the obvious, that most of their examples involved Chinese Americans leaking to China, Jewish Americans leaking to Israel, a Russian American leaking to Russia, etc. And I asked how we should handle that information as we go forth to spy and inform on our work colleagues. And you could hear a pin drop in the place. This, by the way, is how you make yourself very popular with the rank and file and very unpopular with upper management. But I wouldn't have poked the bear if I didn't think they were all doing us a genuine disservice by not addressing the question, because it's an important question and relevant one. And so the trainer's clearly uncomfortable and doesn't want to answer the question, but at least he was honest. He told us not to consider that information at all, to put it out of our minds. I understand his discomfort. I got a bunch of raised eyebrows and dirty looks just for asking the question. It's a hard problem for a multi-ethnic, multicultural, open society like ours. It's a genuinely hard problem. Over in China, Chinese intelligence probably has a file on every single person of European ancestry in their entire country. And they're not putting anyone whose parents were German American in charge of their military research laboratories. And there aren't many people like that in China anyway. During the Cold War, we were able to call on ideological sympathy to recruit assets from behind the Iron Curtain. But we can't appeal to a foreigner's American patriotism or ethnic pride the way that other countries might be able to call on ethnic pride or nationalism to recruit assets in America. Moreover, when you try to ferret out disloyalty in large groups, where the pattern of offender is predictable, but the vast majority of people are not a problem, things can go wrong very fast. It's really hard to be effective without casting a very wide net, but casting a wide net for potential traitors and saboteurs and subversives has been the cause of many of the ugliest events in human history. A few Japanese Americans help a downed Japanese pilot on the Hawaiian island of Niihau after Pearl Harbor, and pretty soon 120,000 Japanese are being rounded up and thrown into camps. And so I can understand why the trainer just wanted to get through his course without addressing a topic that might not have any good answer, but that we know from experience has many bad ones. But I put him on the horns of a dilemma, and I left him with only 2 choices, neither of them very good. He could do what he did and tell us not to notice what was very obvious and relevant information, which would undermine his training by showing that the government is not so concerned about protecting military secrets that it would risk offending anyone. Or he could go the other route and risk becoming the subject of an HR complaint for telling us to watch out for those sneaky Ruskies, Chinamen, and Jews. Maybe there's a healthy, acceptable middle ground in there, but I don't blame him for not wanting to find out. But we're not talking about nationalities or religions or ethnicities. We are talking about the behavior of governments and intelligence agencies. If someone brings up MK Ultra or CIA interference in other countries, I don't pull up like, how dare you say that about Americans? The CIA is not synonymous with Americans. Just like Chinese state security is not synonymous with Chinese people, and the Mossad is not synonymous with Jews. When we refuse to deal honestly with the history for fear of what people might do with this information, we just drive the discussion underground where it rots and festers and its stink reemerges at inconvenient and unexpected moments. Let's say your kid wanders accidentally onto 4chan and someone there says something about the disproportionate number of Jews in the first Soviet governments and secret police. And your kid thinks, well, I've never heard that. I'm going to go ask my teacher, Mrs. Silverstein. Mrs. Silverstein, I read online that a majority of the communist secret police were Jewish. Is that true? And Mrs. Silverstein says, of course that's not true. And if you continue with that nonsense, you're going to end up in the principal's office, young man. He can't even really find much on Google. He has to use DuckDuckGo to get any straightforward information on the topic. And of course, he finds out eventually that it is true, and that this guy on 4chan was the only one who didn't lie to him about it. Well, what other secret knowledge does the guy on 4chan have? Oh, he says it wasn't just the early Soviet government. He says there's a global conspiracy by powerful Jews against white Christian countries. Well, he would ask Mrs. Silverstein about this, or his parents, because they should know, but he's already learned that they're either lying or part of the cover-up. And so now he's cut off from outside influences on the subject, and he's in this whole rabbit hole. It's like a mental disease I've seen consume intelligent people before my very eyes. One day someone is criticizing the Mossad, and you're like, right on. Next day he's talking about the USS Liberty, you're like, okay. And before long, you can't bring the guy into mixed company because he cannot get through a conversation without mentioning the Jews. This happens. This is to a great extent the result of having legitimate discussions on some of these topics controlled and shut down. It's not the result of a failure to control or shut down these discussions. And this is a difficult obstacle to getting people to look squarely at the Jeffrey Epstein story. No one would worry much about suggesting that Jeffrey Epstein was being run by Russian intelligence. But everyone seems to know that they're walking on thin ice when they bring up the overwhelming circumstantial evidence of his involvement with Israeli intelligence. But these are just tricks. And again, not tricks by nations or religions or ethnicities, but by governments and intelligence agencies who want to control discourse for their own purposes. They're just tricks, and we should not fall for them. Part 2.
Bill, I know what happened last night. And I know what's been going on since then. And I think you just might have the wrong idea about one or two things. Okay, he had a bruise on his face. That's a hell of a lot less than he deserves. Listen, Bill, I don't think you realize what kind of trouble you were in last night. Who do you think those people were? Those were not just ordinary people there. If I told you their names, I'm not going to tell you their names, but if I did, I don't think you'd sleep so well.
Have you seen this?
Yes, I have.
I saw her body in the morgue. Was she... Was she the woman at the bank?
Yes. She was.
Victor, the woman lying dead in the morgue was the woman at the party.
Yes?
Well, Victor, maybe I'm missing something here. You called it a fake, a charade. Do you mind telling me what kind of fucking charade ends with somebody turning up dead?
Okay, Bill, let's cut the bullshit, all right? You've been way out of your depth for the last 24 hours. You want to know what kind of a charade? I'll tell you exactly what kind. That whole play-acted, take-me, phony sacrifice that you've been jerking yourself off with had absolutely nothing to do with her real death. Nothing happened to her after you left that party that hadn't happened to her before. She got her brains fucked out. Period. When they took her home, she was just fine. And the rest of it is right there in the paper. She was a junkie. She OD'd. There was nothing suspicious. Her door was locked from the inside. The police are happy. End of the story. Come on. It was always going to be just a matter of time with her. Remember? You told her so yourself. You remember the one with the great tits who OD'd in my bathroom? Listen, Bill, nobody killed anybody. Someone died. It happens all the time. But life goes on. It always does. Until it doesn't. But you know that, don't you?
When you're dealing with a situation like the Jeffrey Epstein issue and his potential connections to intelligence agencies, relationships with intelligence agencies. For all of our sort of conspiratorializing about the CIA and all the stuff we do know about what intelligence agencies have gotten up to in the 20th century, superficially, a lot of us are super cynical. You know, like, oh, they would do anything. They would overthrow governments just to help a corporation increase the bottom line, whatever it is. We have no problem theoretically believing that they would be capable of these things. But in reality, when we're confronted with something new, not something from history, something emerges like this Epstein story, and most people, including myself, tend to have a sort of block that they have to overcome, where you still, despite all of that, have this sort of inborn base assumption that no, they wouldn't do that. Like, that's too far. It's just not possible. That it's not possible. Right? Somebody would have spoken up. It's just not possible. But the thing is, it's happened before. It's happened before in Northern Ireland. In the early 1960s, a young Ulsterman named Colin Wallace was recruited into the British Army's public relations and psychological operations branch in Northern Ireland. Up to this point, there hadn't really been much trouble between Catholics and Protestants for some time. And so at the time, the Northern Ireland assignment was kind of considered a sleepy assignment, place people would go to retire, things like that. And that's how it was when Wallace first got picked up there. But then the 1960s happened, and just about every country had its version of the 1960s. And so by 1968, Northern Irish Catholics were out in the streets protesting their political domination by the Protestants that were loyal to the British Empire. Fists in the air, led to fists in the face. Fists led to bottles and rocks, which led to tear gas, and bullets, which led to bombs. And before long, the dark era known as the Troubles had begun in Northern Ireland. And so all of a sudden, the Northern Ireland assignment for British military intelligence and administrative officials was no longer considered a retirement tour. Suddenly, it was at the center of British foreign and, in a way, domestic policy. As far as the security services were concerned, it was the first priority. This was a view of the situation with which our guy, Colin Wallace, the intelligence officer who was hired there that we're talking about, he actually agreed with this outlook wholeheartedly. You know, he was one of those guys, you know, the type who just finds his home in the military. Colin Wallace was. He loves everything about the military, takes his duty completely seriously, buys into everything they tell him, believes whatever the official sources in his country tell him is going on. That's who this guy was, just an unironic true believer. In Northern Ireland, his job was to cause other people to believe the same way. With the beginning of the Troubles, his job had gone from, you know, a steady routine of like a PR professional, publicizing community outreach events and fielding mundane questions from the press, to now being engaged in full-on information warfare and black propaganda designed to help fight the war on Irish terror. And so, for example, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, which was the militant wing of the IRA that the British were struggling with in Northern Ireland, had gotten its hands on some Russian-made rocket launchers at one point. And these rocket launchers had a defect in the firing mechanism that often caused them to malfunction and occasionally explode on the user. The British authorities had captured a few of these and were able to figure out the cause of the failures, but they didn't want the IRA to figure it out. At least they wanted to delay them figuring it out as long as possible. And so they planted stories in the press. This is one of Colin Wallace's projects, planting stories in the press saying that the launchers had been found to be defective, but that it was due to something other than the firing mechanism, the trigger mechanism. It wasn't really meant to hold up over time, but if it distracts the IRA from the confident use of these rocket launchers for a while until they figured out, that would be considered a win. That was the kind of thing that he was engaged in. And fair enough, right? Fair enough use of information ops in a troubled area with a counterinsurgency going on. Other times they would plant rumors in the press or among just the people about Irish rebel leaders, and they would put out stories designed to cause the public to hate and blame the IRA for the violence. Basic propaganda stuff. It was also his job to deal with any PR fallout from the mass roundups and detention without trial of large numbers of Irish Catholics. In 1972, a demonstration against this policy of roundup and internment without trial, a demonstration against this was fired upon by British soldiers. 14 unarmed people got killed, another 12 were wounded. And things kind of kept escalating. Bombings became a regular occurrence. Ugly, small unit street fighting and ambushes that don't end with one guy hoisting a flag up on top of a building in victory, but with the other guy being tied to a chair in a damp basement. So the British SAS is brought in, Special Air Service, sort of their special forces, and many counterinsurgency experts with experience in Kenya and other parts of the world are brought in. And at a certain point, I believe in 1973, responsibility for intelligence operations in Northern Ireland is transferred from the portfolio of MI6, which is Britain's foreign intelligence agency like the CIA, to MI5, which is Britain's domestic intelligence agency, sort of like the FBI, not exactly, but... MI6 had traditionally handled Northern Ireland, even though it was technically a domestic operation because Ireland was a foreign country and it was just easier for the same agency to cover both Ireland and Northern Ireland. But for some reason, it was transferred to MI5 in the middle of all this trouble in the early 70s. And all the people involved say that things really began to change once MI5 took charge. The information operations that Colin Wallace was taking part in became much more aggressive. They began planting completely false stories in the press, maligning Catholic leaders, attempting to incite infighting, and using these false stories to influence public opinion, not only in Ireland, but in Northern Ireland and in Britain itself. So they were propagandizing the British people now. And Colin Wallace is going along with all this like a good soldier. I mean, he's doing his job to fight the war on terror. That's how he's still approaching this. It's the kind of guy he is, sir, yes, sir. And over time, he becomes just, you read the reports and the testimony of people who were there, people he worked for, who worked for him, and he becomes a major figure up there as far as like the middle management of the military intelligence apparatus that's dealing with this area. Very respected, recognized expert on Northern Ireland, and he's often brought in to answer questions and provide briefs to generals and high government officials. And at 29 years old, he becomes the youngest person ever to make lieutenant colonel in the British military. Or at least he was the youngest one at the time. Maybe that's what it is. After Bloody Sunday, that bloodbath in 72 that I mentioned a second ago, politicians back in Britain are starting to feel pressure to put an end to this whole problem in Northern Ireland. And so they start making noises about peace, negotiation. A conservative government is in charge at the time, and even they're talking about going to meet with leaders of the Irish Republican Army to try to work something out. The Labour Party opposition is talking openly about cutting a deal if they win the next election. And soon those meetings with the IRA do start to happen, and the security services in Northern Ireland, MI5, military intelligence, they go into like full panic mode. They're just not having it. Quote, in 1972, Prime Minister Harold Wilson met with IRA leaders in Dublin, and the next year the Northern Ireland Minister, Willie Whitelaw, made similar contacts. This utterly shocked opinion in every officer's mess in Ulster, and in MI5, who took over intelligence operations there from MI6 in 1973. Exactly like the French army before it in Algeria, these key circles within the British Army now decided that in order to prevent a sellout of the imperial position in the overseas province by leftists, Guy Millet, Harold Wilson, or weak-minded centrists, Pierre Fimlin, Edward Heath, the military must ensure that the right sort of government came to power. Operation Clockwork Orange was precisely this, an attempt to smear and undermine labor leaders and Tory wets alike. The short-term aim being to prevent Labour being elected in February 1974 and to depose the likes of Heath and Whitelaw from the Tory leadership. Anyone who helped the minority Labour government in power was fair game. Thanks to Peter Wright's revelations, and Peter Wright was a high-level British intelligence officer who wrote an expose about some of this, we are more or less familiar with what went on in this period, though it is important to say that Colin Wallace was the first to make public admission of these campaigns, well before Wright. Homosexual smears were directed against Edward Heath, Jeremy Thorpe, Norman St. John Stevas, and Humphrey Berkeley. Bogus bank accounts showing corrupt earnings were contrived for Edward Short and Ian Paisley. Wilson was seen as the beneficiary of, and a possible participant in, the assassination of Hugh Gateskill. Lists were drawn up of such notorious communists and communist sympathizers as Brian Walden, David Owen, Robert Mellish, John Stonehouse, Roy Hattersley, and Reg Prentice. And even a bogus pamphlet on revolutionary strategy for the installation of socialism in Britain was contrived for off-the-record briefing of American journalists the joint authors being Tony Benn, Stan Orm, and Dennis Healy. One is tempted to say that even in the MI5 officers' mess, the idea of Dennis Healy collaborating with Mr. Benn and Mr. Orm on anything at all must surely have required the assistance of a few double whiskeys. The unhappier truth is that the minds that made such things up were quite possibly stone-cold sober. Colin Wallace excelled at these black propaganda operations and for several years enjoyed his work. Gradually, though, he became uneasy at the extent to which his job seemed to be mainly about smearing and undermining British politicians rather than combating terrorism in Ireland. Moreover, the army was now making its own Northern Ireland policy in a breathtakingly independent way. When the Heath government brought in a power-sharing executive in Northern Ireland with the Sunningdale Agreement of December 73, many within the army seemed to have seen this as the beginning of the end. Before long, a wet Tory or Labour government would sell out to the IRA completely. Accordingly, when the Ulster Workers' Council decided to launch a general strike to bring down the power-sharing executive, not only did it receive sympathetic backing from the army, but there is even evidence that the strike was planned and encouraged by MI5 and its adjutants in Army Intelligence and Information Policy. To mask what was being prepared and to create an emotional following wind in Britain, it was decided to launch a publicity blitz about an IRA doomsday plot, a plan for the evacuation of 100,000 Catholics to the south and a scorched earth policy in the north. The plan had been drawn up by the IRA as a contingency plan against the possibility of a massive Protestant attack on Catholic areas of Ulster. It would now be presented as if it were an offensive strategy in its own right. When he saw what was being cooked up, Colin Wallace objected. The idea of the plot was several years old and had already been used back in 1972. He couldn't, he said, recycle such old stuff without losing credibility. But you don't have to, he was told. We'll get the Prime Minister to do it. And so they did. On 13 May 1974, Harold Wilson announced a dramatic revelation to the House of Commons, a suitably purple version of the Doomsday Plot fed to Wilson by the Army puppet masters. Wilson even went so far as to warn the House that there will be an attempt to misrepresent this information, which is a genuine find by the security authorities, but I can assure the House that these documents are genuine and not even put forward by the IRA themselves for any purpose except that in which it had in mind to pursue. Just 12 days later, under strong Army pressure, Wilson caved into the UWC strike and threw the power-sharing executive to the wolves. Such incidents served to increase Wallace's concern that the Army was moving away from its alleged primary role of fighting terrorism. Worse, he became uneasy that the increasing number of assassinations and bomb outrages against Catholics might be taking place with Army encouragement, perhaps even with covert Army planning. So, in October 1974, Wallace announced that he didn't wish to work on Clockwork Orange anymore, that he was resigning in order to go back to fighting terrorism. End quote. And so a few weeks after he makes that announcement that he'd be moving on, Colin Wallace files another report. And this is a report about a boys' home, an orphanage basically, a boys' home in Northern Ireland in the city of Belfast. It's called the Kincora Boys' Home. And this was actually the second time that Wallace had filed a report about this place. This boys' home was being run by a loyalist paramilitary leader, widely believed, very, very widely believed, quite reliably to be an agent of British intelligence, a guy named William McGrath. Wallace starts seeing intelligence linking many high-ranking Northern Irish and British officials to pedophiliac activities, and soon Wallace sees that the stories seem to revolve around this place, Kincora Boys' Home. It turns out that complaints had been made about sexual abuse happening at Kincora before, more than once, but they were always ignored. After Wallace satisfies himself that he has an idea of what's going on there, he brings the information to his superiors, and he's ignored. And so he tries again. the second time here that we're talking about, and this time he's told to back off. Another officer, an Army captain named Brian Gemmell, also saw what was happening, tried to report it, but he was told to back off. This is from an article in the Belfast Telegraph, quote, "In emotional scenes, Richard Kerr, a former Kincora resident who was sexually abused at the boys' home, has received an apology from the military intelligence officer who tried to expose the abuse. Brian Gemmell's words represent the first time Mr. Kerr has ever received an apology from the authorities who failed him. Mr. Gemmell was warned off revealing the pedophile activity at the East Belfast home by Ian Cameron, a senior MI5 officer who told him that this was not a matter for the intelligence services or the Army to be concerned with. Now Mr. Gemmell believes it was part of a cover-up of sex abuse by top people. He suspects that the intelligence services used such dark secrets as a way to control abusers who were politically influential. As a captain, Mr. Gemmell put in an official report about Kincora to a senior MI5 officer. But to his astonishment, he claims he was ordered to stop digging and to forget about it. He now feels that he should have exposed it, whatever the consequences for his Army career." End quote. And so Colin Wallace can't make any headway with his superiors. He decides that this is important enough to go to the press about. He's got a lot of connections in the press. He's interacted with these people for a long time. Thinks he might be able to do that, but, and this is a quote from a review of a book about the Colin Wallace issue and Kincora and Clockwork Orange and all this, book by a journalist named Paul Foote called Who Framed Colin Wallace? It's a very good book. This is a review of it, from a review in the London Review of Books. Quote, "No newspaper in the UK was willing to follow this obvious lead, or even to publish the story, despite the fact that McGrath's associates constituted a virtual who's who of Protestant Ulster. What was going on at Kincora was that the destitute boys were being systematically sodomized and abused by McGrath and his friends, who included Kincora's official director and assistant director. This had been going on for many years, perhaps from as early as 1959, and repeated attempts by boys who had been raped to get the RUC interested in the matter had always failed. Nothing in Foote's book is more heartbreaking than his recounting of how, over 20 years, a series of boys, and sometimes their families and social workers, tried desperately and unavailingly to put a stop to their dreadful pain, humiliation, and buggery, and how the police, the press, and the authorities failed them over and over again. Quite clearly, neither the RUC nor Army intelligence were at all keen for the Kincora story to be broken. This was so partly because McGrath and his friends were extremely well connected within the Protestant establishment. But the truth may have been worse than that. Intelligence services around the world often find it useful to maintain luxury brothels, not just for what they learn from pillow talk, but as multi-purpose centers of reward, blackmail, and assignation. There was nothing luxurious about Kincora, but its rarity in the Northern Irish context as an unlimited source of boys who could be buggered without mercy or publicity seems likely to have made it an especially useful intelligence asset. So in his insistent attempts to open up the Kincora story, Colin Wallace was rocking the boat just as much as he was by refusing to have anything to do with Clockwork Orange. Quote, well, the Boy Scout, Colin Wallace, the naive Boy Scout, found out what kind of people he was messing with very soon. And this is from that same review, quote, there can be no other explanation for what then happened to Wallace. He was suddenly smeared in a number of press articles, transferred abruptly out of Northern Ireland, and as soon as he got to England, dismissed from the army on trumped-up charges of having wrongly retained secret documents and given them to the press. What is truly remarkable is the speed and thoroughness with which Wallace was dealt with. One moment he was an indispensable man, the next he was sacked, disgraced, persecuted, and made into a non-person. The Ministry of Defense has, ever since, denied that Wallace had been in intelligence at all. Thereafter, steps were taken to prevent him from getting other employment, and he was endlessly, miserably harassed. The author Foote is scrupulous at every stage in trying to see whether a case against Wallace might not be made to stand up. And he makes it clear that he and Wallace do not see eye to eye about politics, Ireland, the Army, or just about anything else. But no fair-minded person can read this book and doubt Wallace's story. The only question one is left asking is how naive Wallace was really being when he raised objections first to Clockwork Orange and then to King Cora. Surely he was both too senior and too intelligent not to have known that both matters were utter dynamite, and that one could not simply sign off on an operation like Clockwork Orange, which involved key MI5 and Army operatives in acts of high treason. Was it not obvious that anyone who did try to sign off and then threatened to blow open the King Cora scandal for good measure would be seen as a dangerous man who knew too much to be left alone? Far worse was to follow for Wallace. He at last gained a post as information officer for the Arun District Council in Sussex, for whom he worked with his customary zeal and success. In various small ways, he continued to be the subject of official harassment and surveillance, but in April 1980, he finally consented to be an off-the-record source for a journalist seeking to probe the rumors of an MI5 plot against the Harold Wilson government. At almost the same time that these articles were published, 4 years before the Spycatcher disclosures, those are Peter Wright's book, the King Cora scandal finally surfaced to the press. This had nothing to do with Wallace, but the powers that be, who had not wanted these skeletons out of the cupboard, were doubtless confirmed in their view that it was too dangerous to have Wallace wandering around free. 3 months later, Wallace was arrested, found guilty of the manslaughter of his friend Jonathan Lewis, and bundled off to jail, whence he only emerged in December 1986. It is, however, worth pointing out that Wallace's account of the attempted destabilization of Heath and Wilson was taken deadly seriously where it mattered most. Clive Pointing describes the atmosphere inside the Ministry of Defense after Wallace had been jailed. There was never any suspicion that Wallace was making these stories up or that it was totally unfounded and very easy to rubbish. It was very much a matter that, okay, the story was being contained at the moment because he was in jail, but in a few years' time he would be out again and could be expected to start making the allegations again, and then that would be a serious problem. Meanwhile, there was still King Cora. The awkward question had to be faced as to why the boys of King Cora had gone on being raped and abused for 20 years, despite repeated complaints to the police and despite Wallace's complaints to Army intelligence. From all sides of the Irish political spectrum came accusations of a police and intelligence cover-up. To make matters worse, it emerged that McGrath had apparently worked for MI6 even before he became the arch-villain of King Cora, and was given to boasting of his links with MI6 and his friends in MI5. The first official inquiry by the McGonigal Committee was promised that no limits would be placed on its investigation. As soon as it met, however, it was told that it could not examine any matter the police were currently looking into, or which was covered by criminal charges in the past or in the future. Since just about everything to do with the scandal was covered by criminal charges, including the possibility of a cover-up, a majority of the committee's members resigned on the spot, and the inquiry collapsed after less than a day, an occurrence unique in British history. James Pryor, then Minister for Northern Ireland, announced that the police investigation would continue. As for the question of whether there had been a cover-up after Colin Wallace and others had drawn attention to the King Cora scandal, this would be investigated by Sir George Terry, Chief Constable of Sussex, who had just put Wallace away for manslaughter. Better still, the man appointed by Terry to take charge of the King Cora inquiry was Gordon Harrison, who had been in charge of Wallace's prosecution. Unsurprisingly, no Terry report was ever issued. Instead, Terry merely appeared at a press conference with Sir John Herman, Chief Constable of the RUC, which Terry was... RUC is the Royal Ulster Constabulary. It's the police force there in Northern Ireland, which Terry was supposed to have been investigating, where he announced, "I am satisfied that there is no substance to allegations that Army intelligence had knowledge of homosexual abuse at King Cora." Given that Wallace had provided exactly that knowledge to Army intelligence many years before, the polite word for Terry's conclusion was incredible, though it is fair to add that other words were used at the time by some. The Northern Ireland Alliance Party, moderate as ever, referred to Terry's conclusions as misleading and blatantly dishonest. James Pryor now found himself besieged by demands for another Kincora inquiry, this time by a high court judge, as befitted the gravity of the case. Pryor paid fulsome tribute to Terry, accepted that there would have to be another inquiry, i.e. that Terry's was unsatisfactory, but then set up a low-level affair under Judge Hughes, a retired circuit judge. Mr. Pryor did, however, specifically assure the House that it would be within Hughes' terms of reference to investigate the allegation of a cover-up. That is, the question of why there had been no inquiry into Kincora before 1980. Judge Hughes quickly developed other ideas. On opening his inquiry, he said that what it was about was the administration of boys' homes, and that the inquiry would have nothing to do with the allegations carried on in the newspapers and on television that there was any kind of cover-up of the Kincora affair, or that there was a vice ring in operation. Hughes refused to interview not only those convicted of offenses against the Kincora boys, but even Mr. Roy Garland, who had complained to the security forces about Kincora as long ago as 1972, and had specifically pointed the finger at William McGrath as the evil genius of the affair. Mr. Robert McCartney, QC, representing the Kincora boys, could hardly contain himself. Are my wits leaving me? A man who detonated an entire police inquiry and put the finger at a fairly early stage on the man subsequently convicted for some of the most brutal acts of sodomy is not a relevant or material witness? At this point, this already extraordinary story becomes positively surreal. Wallace, asked to give evidence to the Hughes inquiry, agrees to do so only if he's allowed to tell everything, and is granted immunity from prosecution under the Official Secrets Act for doing so. Just to be clear, he's not asking for blanket immunity. He's asking for immunity just for testifying about things that are covered under secrecy laws. This is turned down by Mrs. Thatcher personally. Wallace sends a whole file of notes to number 10 Downing Street for onward transmission to Hughes, but most of the documents mysteriously get stolen by number 10 and are never supplied to Hughes. The Hughes report is another complete whitewash. Faced with a document from Wallace proving that he had raised the Kincora question back in 1974, Hughes avers that it might have been a forgery and therefore can be ignored. A file of documents on Kincora is then sent on to Teddy Taylor, the right-wing Tory MP who had shown great interest in the case. Taylor places this file in a locked cupboard in a locked office under a 24-hour-a-day police guard. It is nonetheless stolen, producing a furious complaint from David Owen MP that even the House of Commons is no longer safe from burglary. End quote. So what's going on in a situation like this? What's going on here? Don't answer that yet. Here's another story, also from Britain. This is from the Manchester Evening News. Quote, the Westminster establishment turned a blind eye to child abuse allegations against former Rochdale MP Cyril Smith for decades, a long-awaited national inquiry has found. Smith and other high-profile members of Parliament were protected from police action by their parties as their whips tried to avoid damaging gossip and scandal. The Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, IICSA, concluded in a damning assessment of political culture spanning years. The IICSA inquiry found that both in his case and in those of other suspected MPs, including the late Conservative Sir Peter Morrison, parties and other institutions effectively covered them up. Professor Alexis Jay, who chaired the inquiry, said, "It is clear to see that Westminster institutions have repeatedly failed to deal with allegations of child sexual abuse, from turning a blind eye to actively shielding abusers. A consistent pattern emerged of failures to put the welfare of children above political status. The report found institutions including the Liberal Party and the police had known full well that both Smith and others had been abusing children, however. It stated, for example, in the 1970s and 1980s, MPs, including Liberal politicians Sir Cyril Smith and Sir Peter Morrison, were found to be active in their sexual interest in children, but were protected from prosecution, it found." Okay, well, you would be justified in asking, that's end quote, you would be justified in asking, what kind of a person, like forget about the perpetrators for a second. What kind of person would cover for someone engaged in the serial sexual abuse of children? It's another part of it that is like, I think, a block to people really getting their arms around this. They just can't imagine that. And I remember I was in high school journalism class many years ago, and on the first day of the class, the journalism teacher, was giving us all a lecture that was meant to drive home the importance of certain journalistic principles. It was like a big intro, welcome to journalism. And he created a scenario. He said there was once a reporter who had multiple young women independently telling him that they had been raped in the same area of town by a guy with a matching description. He does some homework, corroborates their story, starts writing this story up. Serial rapist loose on the West Side. And so then his phone rings, and it's the police. It's the lead officer pursuing a case against a man that they believe to be the rapist. And he's heard that the reporter was writing a story about it. He talked to the victims, and they told him that they had been speaking with this reporter. And so the cop has called him to ask for a favor. He said if the reporter runs the story tomorrow, the rapist is going to get spooked. He's going to cover all his tracks. They'll never catch him. And so can you just hold off for a few days while the cops tie up some loose ends and get what they need to actually nail this guy and get him off the street? After that, he'll have the exclusive on the story. Well, the reporter's a good citizen, and he wants to help out, so he agrees. And a week later, sure enough, the cops catch the guy. He admits everything. He's on his way to prison. He publishes his story the same day and lets it be known that he and the paper cooperated with law enforcement by delaying publication. The next day, he's at his desk when a woman approaches and asks if he's the reporter who wrote that story, and he says he is. And she starts cursing at him and crying and says that in the days after you decided to delay your story, that man raped me, and I might have avoided that if you had done your job of letting the public know something as basic as the fact that there was a rapist prowling around the neighborhood. My teacher wanted to drive home the idea that a journalist stands outside of all political and judicial and even safety and national security concerns. That their God is not peace or justice or safety. Their only God is truth. That's the message he was pushing to us. He wanted us to understand journalism as an almost sacred calling that must be taken deadly seriously if an open society is going to be possible. Well, so he put this question to us, what would we have done in that situation? And he told us, he asked us that question before he kind of told us the punchline at the very end. And you find that your instincts can kind of betray you on that question. I can't remember how I answered when he put the question to us, but for sure a lot of the students said that they would have helped the cops by delaying the story for understandable reasons. But the thing we're talking about here, this is much less understandable. We're talking about something several levels beneath that. Something that's much harder for normal people to relate to. And put yourself in that position where you're in some position of responsibility. You're a journalist at a major newspaper, TV network, or you're a police officer or intelligence official or some official with oversight over some given area. And you learn about systematic child sexual abuse taking place somewhere. But you're told to drop the issue and that there will be consequences for you if you keep on it. And we've all got families to feed. None of us wants to be fired. But I just can't imagine that there are many people listening right now who are not pretty confident that you would refuse to stay quiet about it. We're not talking about embezzling funds here. We're not even talking about leaking secrets to a foreign country. We're talking about raping little children. And so we, regular people, consider the issue and we think, I don't really think there's a single person that I consider a friend who would go along with this. And yet, for some reason, there always seems to be plenty of people willing to go along with it, concentrated among government officials, teachers' unions and school officials, high-ranking law enforcement and intelligence officials, major media figures. This is from BuzzFeed News. This was published just a few weeks ago, actually, in December 2021. Quote, secret CIA files say staffers committed sex crimes involving children. Declassified CIA Inspector General reports show a pattern of abuse and a repeated decision by federal prosecutors not to hold agency personnel accountable. Over the past 14 years, the Central Intelligence Agency has secretly amassed credible evidence that at least 10 of its employees and contractors committed sexual crimes involving children, but only one of the individuals was ever charged with a crime. Prosecutors sent the rest of the cases back to the CIA to handle internally, meaning few faced any consequences beyond the possible loss of their jobs and security clearances. That marks a striking deviation from how sex crimes involving children have been handled at other federal agencies, such as the Department of Homeland Security and the Drug Enforcement Administration. CIA insiders say the agency resists prosecution of its staff for fear the cases will reveal state secrets. End quote. How exactly would prosecuting a pedophile risk revealing state secrets? They don't say. And if a pedophile works at McDonald's, prosecuting him is not going to risk divulging the secret to making McDonald's fries so good. You know, were these people engaged in their mission at the time that they were committing these crimes against children? Did the abuse have something to do with their work for the CIA? If not, then what the hell? You throw them out of the agency, hand them over to a prosecutor, and put them in prison. How does that endanger state secrets? And the fact that they're so resistant to putting them on the stand or to holding a trial and having discovery is, I say, pretty solid proof that we're not talking about janitors and food service workers here, but CIA employees engaged in sensitive intelligence work. I mean, this is at an organization where they are very sensitive to the possibility of their employees being vulnerable to bribery or blackmail. You get kicked out of the CIA if your credit score drops too low, or if you owe too much money, or you get popped on a drug test. You know, your clearance is suspended or revoked, and you're out of there. And yet there are, 10, 12, maybe more CIA employees engaged in serious offenses against children, and it gets swept under the rug. And how are there so many? You know, the CIA is not that big of an organization. And these were not minor offenses, not that any offense against a child's minor. These are very serious. Quote, one employee had sexual contact with a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old. He was fired. A second employee purchased 3 sexually explicit videos of young girls filmed by their mothers. He resigned. A third employee estimated that he had viewed up to 1,400 sexually abusive images of children while on agency assignments. The records do not say what action, if any, the CIA took against him. A contractor who arranged for sex with an undercover FBI agent posing as a child had his contract revoked. Only one of the individuals cited in these documents was charged with a crime. In that case, as in the only previous known case of a CIA staffer being charged with sexual crimes, the employee was also under investigation for mishandling classified material, end quote. So the one employee who was actually charged with a crime was already in trouble for something else, and they just decided to pile on. Quote, 4 former officials who are familiar with how internal investigations work at intelligence agencies told BuzzFeed News there are many reasons that prosecutors might not pursue a criminal case. One of them, familiar with the workings of the CIA's Office of Inspector General, said the agency is concerned that in a criminal case, it could lose control of sensitive information. The former official, who reviewed the declassified Inspector General reports, characterized the concern from CIA lawyers as, we can't have these people testify. They may inadvertently be forced to disclose sources and methods. The official, who noted the agency has had a problem with child abuse images stretching back decades, said they understand the need to protect sensitive and classified equities. However, for crimes of a certain class, whether it's an intelligence agency or not, You just have to figure out how to prosecute these people, end quote. And, quote, sexual crimes involving children, including the viewing of images of abuse, have been uncovered at other agencies that handle sensitive information. In a November 2009 report, the Department of Defense acknowledged that dozens of Pentagon staff members or contractors had such images. In 2014, the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community found that 2 officials from the National Reconnaissance Office, which oversees America's spy satellites, acknowledged viewing images of child sexual abuse during polygraph examinations. At a symposium in 2016, Daniel Payne, a top Pentagon security official, said that when workers' computers were examined, quote, the amount of child porn I see is just unbelievable, end quote. So, you remember at the beginning of the previous episode when I said I just wanted to make one request from the regime, from the people in power. And I understand it's difficult and I don't expect a lot, so I'm really trying to limit my request to something realistic. Is it too much to ask that we don't have dozens or more pedophiles working in sensitive positions at the Pentagon and the CIA? Now, how does that happen? There are minimalist and maximalist theories on what's going on in a situation like the one at the Kinkora Boys' Home in Northern Ireland. Now, certainly the evidence, which admittedly is circumstantial, but I talked about that in the previous episode, things are going to be circumstantial here. You know, documents are destroyed, hidden, classified. You know, you're dealing with an entire organization full of people who are committed to secrecy and misinformation. This stuff's going to be circumstantial, and but the weight of circumstantial evidence indicates that a guy connected to British intelligence and his staff were systematically abusing children at this boys' home, that the boys were being pimped out to outsiders, that several victims, as well as intelligence whistleblowers, have said that the crimes involved important people in Britain and Northern Ireland, and that there was a concerted effort from multiple vectors to keep a lid on all of it as much as possible. Like, that's pretty well established. Now, some people take that information and jump to British intelligence must have been running a brutally abusive orphanage for the specific purpose of catching prominent Irish and British citizens in compromising situations so that they could discredit or control them with blackmail. And maybe that's true. I don't put anything past them. But I think maybe a more likely scenario, one that you could maybe sell to a skeptic, where they were, basically these intelligence agencies discovered that the abuse was happening. They saw that there were prominent people involved. And when reports started to float up to decision makers, they didn't say, wow, you can't prosecute him. He's our pedophile. They probably said, look, we know, we get it. It's disgusting, and we hate this too, but we're in the middle of an investigation right now. We're running down leads on some very important people coming through here. We've heard, some people in the place. We've placed surveillance on them, and, we've heard them talk about several important people who have, come through here as abusers before, and we don't want to, we've heard they might be coming back, and we want to catch them. Don't you want to catch these people? That kind of thing. And they say, we promise, as soon as we get what we need, oh yeah, we're right behind you, ready to arrest these animals. And you see this kind of thing in cop movies all the time. And I assume versions of it happen in real life. Local cops have some drug dealer dead to rights, and the FBI or DEA comes in and says, no, we've got a big multi-state investigation going, and, they're going to change all the patterns we've learned, change out all the phones we've tapped, everything, if you let them know that we're on to them just to bust this nobody. And so you need to back off. Whitey Bulger, the Irish mobster up in Boston, he was an FBI informant for years, very famously, and they literally let him get away with murder as long as he kept providing them with a stream of information on other things. In these situations, it's not like the investigators or the intelligence agents are necessarily cool with what's going on. They're just able to convince themselves that this criminal activity is less important than some bigger fish that they're trying to fry. When you're talking about drug dealers, it might just be legit tactic to hold off on the street dealer if you think he might lead you to the distributor. But consider the overall political situation in Britain and Northern Ireland at the time. And these were years where pretty much everybody in the Harold Wilson cabinet says that MI5 was off the reservation running information operations against the government that it was supposed to be serving. They had investigators on politicians that they considered unfriendly, and they were scraping the bottom of the barrel for rumors and accusations against British politicians to air in the press. And so when we learn that during this same period of time, the agencies who were engaged in those operations were being notified that important people were engaging in sex crimes at a boys' home, and that they ignored that information and even attacked the people who were bringing that information to them, then that is some circumstantial evidence, to put the onus on the defenders of MI5 and military intelligence to make their case. They've abused whistleblowers, hidden information, lied, and thrown up controlled investigations that avoid all questions about agency involvement or cover-up. There's a somewhat different version of this kind of minimalist theory that seems to have been at play, I think, in a lot of famous cases in the U.S. over the years. I don't know how many of you have read the book Chaos by Tom O'Neill. Came out in 2019. It's a fascinating book where he documents his investigation, 20-year-long investigation into the crimes of the Manson family. And there's just no way that you can come away from that book thinking that we know everything about what happened with those Manson murders. I'll just leave it at that. You don't have to believe the maximalist alternatives, like Charles Manson was a CIA asset who killed those people as part of his mission from the CIA. You don't have to believe that. But O'Neill demonstrates pretty definitively that the story everybody reads in Bugliosi's Helter Skelter, the canonical book on the Manson family, is just not true. He shows that Manson was in close, long-term contact with men who were involved for many years. For sure, this is not even speculative. He establishes this. Manson was in close, long-term contact for many years with guys who were involved with the CIA mind control program known as MK Ultra. It was focused on plumbing the depths of the human psyche using hypnosis and drugs and other techniques in order to learn more about mind control and psychological warfare. O'Neill shows that Charles Manson is continually let off the hook after being caught with drugs, illegal weapons, stolen cars, underage girls who are drunk and high, despite the fact that the entire time he's on parole. And that his parole officer somehow only managed one parolee, Manson himself, while most of his colleagues managed 30 or 40 parolees. And that parole officer had intelligence connections, and that after Manson moved to San Francisco during the Summer of Love, the parole officer quit being a parole officer and went to work in the government-funded clinic where Manson and his family were visiting every week. This was during a time when intelligence agencies and law enforcement were very interested in the effects these new drugs were having on people. And so one of the things they did, you can read about this in O'Neill's book as well as other places, is that they set up drug houses around the Haight-Ashbury Park where all the hippies were based in 67. And it was just ground zero, really, for hippiedom in these years. And they set up these drug houses with secret rooms and one-way mirrors. And they got grad student research assistants who would go into these places. They were recruited to help with a study. And their job was to basically just go out, find people, bring them into the house, and give them drugs so that the observers in the secret compartments behind the one-way mirrors could watch what happened. And the students keep complaining as the project goes on because they keep saying they don't really know what it is that they're doing or what the point of any of this research is, because it seems like they're just watching people get high and party. So all this is going on, and you have a clinic with at least 2 employees connected to the CIA. Both of them are focused on specifically on scientific work studying the effects of various drugs on human behavior, especially aggressive behavior. And Manson and his family are visiting this place every week during their formative period. He keeps getting arrested with stuff that should be an automatic felony, automatic parole violation, but he's always let off. The LA County Sheriff's Office raided the ranch